So those of you who have been with us before for these webinars, the focus is on the milestone, and this week we're covering milestone 3, and we'll be starting with Eco 201, and then we'll go from 8:30 to 9 for Eco 201, and at 9 o'clock we'll pivot over to Eco 202 and cover milestone 3 for that course. So if you are here as a 201 student, great, we're about to get going, and if you're here as a 202 student, feel free to hang out until 9 o'clock, or free to pop off and come back over at 9. Like I said, the focus is going to be on milestone 3 for both courses, but if you have a question that's more general about the content, please feel free to ask it. We've got two instructors on the chat with us, Ellen Sloss and Kate Stowe, so they will help me keep up with any of your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get started so I don't keep everyone too late. I know we're all super busy this time of year. So we're going to go right into our guide, which is basically, and hopefully you've already seen it from the other milestones, but in the event that you haven't, this just takes you through each step of your paper and walks you through each of the critical elements and explains how to approach each one. So let me make sure I pull up the one for, actually I'll pull up the entire one. Sometimes that's a little bit easier to navigate. And then we can see the whole thing together. Oh, this is the rubric. I'm sorry, this isn't what I want to bring up. Let me get our guide. Here we go. So this will be the guide for milestone 3, is what we have up here. So you'll notice that, and this question comes up for each milestone, because this guide is just for milestone 3 instead of for the entire paper. It does have its own title page. You don't have to have a title page just for milestone 3. If you're adding to the rest of your paper, you can keep it all together. If you are keeping your milestones separate, then just, you can indicate that on the title page. But for this milestone, you do have to cover 3 sections. So these are the last 3 sections of your paper. The first section that you're going to cover is costs of production, and that has 2 critical elements in it. The second section is the overall market section, and that has 3 critical elements. And the last section is on your recommendations for the firm, and that has 3 critical elements as well. Sure, I can enlarge it, and I'm not sure you might be able to enlarge it on your, did that help with the enlarging? The problem is when I enlarge it, I can't see the chat, so that's the only downside. Yeah, you might be able to enlarge it on your own screen. I'm not sure if it gives you that ability. But you all have this document if you want to pull it up on your computers, from your classrooms as well. So that might be another option. All right, so the first critical element in this first section, cost of production, is asking you to analyze the various costs your company faces, their trends over time, and how they've impacted the company's profitability. So to gather this data, you're going to need to go to the annual report. So this is something that we've been talking about a lot in the webinars is, using the annual report as kind of your first stop in terms of gathering information that's specific to your company. And this is another example of that. So here in the guide, there is a link to a great YouTube video on how to read income statements. So the income statements is where it talks about, obviously, the money coming in, which would be the revenue, which you covered in the last milestone. And then it also looks at the cost side. So you'll see cost of goods sold is usually the name of the line item. It might sometimes is cost of sales. It could have another term, but generally it's one of those 2 things. Or it might say COGS, which is the acronym for cost of goods sold. So that's going to give you a general line of all the direct costs that go into producing what the company makes. For Coca-Cola, how much money does it cost for them to actually make their product? So you're going to want to look at those trends over time. For the past 5 or so years, have costs been going up? Have costs been going down? Have they been fluctuating? And then sort of explain, why they've been fluctuating, give some specific examples, and then also discuss what that means for the company's profitability. Now, just like we talked about in the last webinar, revenue increasing or decreasing, generally as a company, we want revenue to increase. But increasing revenue all by itself doesn't mean increasing profit. And decreasing revenue doesn't necessarily mean decreasing profit. Just like with costs, increasing costs does not necessarily mean lower profit. So you really need to look at the two together. So if costs are increasing, but not as much as revenue, then your profit could be going up. So that's something to consider when you look at the impact on profitability. Don't just assume that because costs are going up, that profit is going down. Oh, well, they're spending more money to produce their goods and services. They must not be making as much profit. So those are the things you want to look at. You want to look at the trend over time. What's impacting that trend? Is cost going up because an input price was increasing, or are costs just going up because they're producing and selling more of their goods or services? That would be a wonderful reason for costs to increase. So once you sort of understand what's going on behind that overall trend, you'll explain it here and just discuss what that means for the company's bottom line over that time period. So I'm going to just go back to minimize it and make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. Is it a big difference for everyone when it's enlarged? If it's not a big help, then I'll keep it the way it is so I can keep an eye on the chat. Did not mean to do that. Okay, so some people are saying there's no difference. So I'm gonna leave it as is just to make sure I don't miss any questions you all have. So I don't want to skim over anything that needs more explanation. So again, those are the main things that you want to look at, and it's all bulleted here. You're going to want to get the past 5 years of cost of goods sold. You can present that in a table or graph, sort of like what you did with revenue in the last milestone. And then also operating expenses. So this is kind of setting you up for the next critical element, because the next critical element is going to ask you to look at variable versus fixed costs. So in general, variable costs tend to be captured by cost of goods sold, and fixed costs tend to be captured by operating expenses. Now, it's not always perfectly like that, but in general, that's what you'll see. And once you read more about in the annual report about what's going on after you just look at the raw numbers in the table, it will help you understand the kind of behind the scenes for those numbers. But cost of goods sold is going to capture things like the steel that's used to make the car, or the fabric that's used to make the clothing. Operating expenses would be things like opening a new retail location, and maybe research and development, or salaries of the administrative staff and management employees. So you can see how those things would break down pretty much along variable cost versus fixed cost lines. So here in this critical element, if you've got the data from the annual report broken down, that's going to help you with the next one on fixed versus variable costs. So you already have the data ready. So that's a nice segue. So you've got those bits of data that are very easily available to you, and then you have the explanation, pricing of any major inputs, change in how the goods and services are produced, if that's applicable. We give an example here. And then your analysis of how this affects profitability. So make sure you don't forget this last bullet point to discuss that. So if you cover all of these bullet points as they apply to your company, you should be all set, doing an exemplary job on this element. So the next rubric element under the cost section is asking you to apply the concepts of variable and fixed costs to the company for informing their output decision. So again, like I mentioned, a company's going to have some mix of variable and fixed costs, and generally variable is going to be captured under COGS and fixed would be captured under operating expenses for the most part. And different companies have different breakdowns between variable and fixed costs. And, we've done a lot of work in the course looking at those different things and how the profit for a company plays out as they increase production. And it really makes a difference how much your fixed costs are and how much your variable costs are, to where you get to that point where you're making profit and then you sort of pass that point and you start making too much and you stop making profit. So you have those economies of scale and then the diseconomies of scale. So we've looked at that with some of our examples in our MyLab homeworks and examples in the textbook. Now, obviously, you're not going to have a nice, easy, plug and chug formula to do here. So you're going to be applying this concept a little bit more generally, but the idea is the same, that depending on how those fixed and variable costs are broken down for your particular company, that's going to drive how much they want to make. So a company with high variable costs, growth for them might not be as profitable as growth for a company with high fixed cost. So that's one example. If you're a company that you make some sort of software product, that's a very high fixed cost to develop a software. That research and development that goes into software is very high. But once you've made it and you put it on a disk, the variable cost to sell that disk to millions of customers is very low. So the more customers you can sell it to, the better to make up for that those fixed costs that come from the research and development of creating it to begin with. So you can compare that to somebody like Starbucks, where in order for them to grow, they need to open up more stores, which is, and then they need to buy more coffee beans and more milk and more sugar, and everything is sort of a variable cost, at least in the medium run, for them to be able to make more profit. So it's a very different ballgame depending on the kind of business that you're in. A Starbucks example, they have a very different balance of fixed versus variable costs than a software company. So you'll want to see, first of all, what the balance looks like for your company, and how that might affect their output decisions. How much do they need to grow to become profitable, or how do they need to control their growth to make sure that they don't get into a point where they have diseconomies of scale and are maybe producing too much where they're not making a lot of profit because their variable costs are eating up so much of it. Yeah, and Ellen has a great example there. And that could be, in Ellen's example, that could be the kind of thing that you recommend. And I've seen a lot of students do that, and it's always very impressive with some of the ideas that students come up with. And if you read Ellen's example of managing risk in terms of variable costs, like you get a year or many years contract of coffee bean prices in the Starbucks example. Or a company might try to vertically integrate themselves, meaning they buy a company that is that supplies a major input for them, so they can control that input stream. So I've heard examples of that with beer companies. Well, hops is a big variable cost for brewers. So in that instance, if they could control the hops by owning a hops farm, or having it, investing in a hops farm, then that could mitigate that risk in terms of variable cost, and it would help them manage their output a little bit better. Yep. So some more great examples. So those are some things to think about, and it gives you a chance to think a little bit outside the box, maybe use some of your professional experience. You might not have experience in the industry that your company that you've picked is in, but you all have some sort of professional experience to draw on, and you might have seen your company do something like that, and it might give you some ideas of how the company that you're writing your paper on could do something similar in their industry. So that's just some food for thought. But this is the approach that we're looking for, really breaking down those fixed and variable costs, detailing them specifically, and giving a suggestion about what their output decisions are going to look like. Amy asks, would that be like how Nike bought out so many sneaker businesses? Amy, that's actually a better example of what we're going to get into next, because that's a competitor. So when you buy out competitors, that's usually a way that you are seeking to get a bigger market share, rather than controlling input prices. So that is a very important thing that businesses do, but is less about controlling costs, and more about gaining a bigger footprint in the market. So that's a great segue because we are at overall market now. And the first critical element is discuss the market share for your company and its top competitors by providing details on current percentages for each company and describing their trend over time. So what we're looking for you to do here is to find the market share. Now that doesn't mean their share price. That's a common misconception for students, that they think, oh, they're the share, the stock price on the stock market. No, when we say market share, what piece of the pie? So if it's Nike, like in Amy's example, we're just talking about the sneaker industry, not all of workout apparel. But if we're just talking about the sneaker industry, how much of the sneaker industry or sneaker sales in the world or in the United States is Nike's? Is it 50%? Is it 25%? How much is Reebok's? How much is Adidas? How much is Under Armour? And see how that percentage for Nike has changed over time. Has Nike been gaining market share, or have they been losing market share? And why has that been? So in an example like Nike, now I'm not sure what the position is with Nike. So all this I'm saying is hypothetical, but I know that Under Armour is sort of a newcomer. So maybe when there's a newcomer, that chips away at the existing company's market share. Or maybe in the case of Nike, they've been buying up lesser known brands, and that's increased their market share, despite the fact that a company like Under Armour has been coming into that market. So you'll have to look and see what's pushing any changes in either growing market share or shrinking market share for your company. And it could be for a variety of reasons. So do your best to try and explain all the things that might be a factor in changing market share for your company. All right, looks like so Cynthia asks, where is a good place to look for this information? So Cynthia, now a lot of times companies discuss these things in their annual reports, believe it or not. Especially if they're growing in their market share, they're doing this analysis on themselves. But typically, there's industry magazines and industry reports that you can find in just with a straightforward Google search, because like Kate says, the news is going to cover things like, if a particular airline is gaining market share, or, the business newspapers cover this sort of thing all the time. So there are people that do this research and then it gets reported in the news. So that's generally the easiest place. So yeah, Wall Street Journal, Economist, Forbes, maybe even to a lesser extent, the Financial Times. And if any of that is behind a paywall, you can go through the Shapiro Library, and they usually have access to all those major publications. But yep, so I would definitely look at the annual report for your company and the competitors, and of course, just a simple Google search to find it in a news reporting outlet. And if you happen to know from your research if there is an industry magazine, like the automotive industry, they've got tons of publications dedicated to that industry. That would be a good place to go directly instead of just, randomly Googling. You could go directly to that site, to their website and look there. But not everybody's company is going to have, so many publications dedicated to just their industry. All right, so that covers market share. Actually, one other thing to mention about market share. It is preferable, again, and again, this is to hone your skills in presenting information, to show something graphically. So if you can get the market shares for your company and their top competitors, and show that in like a pie chart, then that would be an ideal situation. Instead of just, talking about it in a sentence and listing it out. It's always better when you have numbers like that to show it in some sort of visual way, especially when you're writing a paper, because sometimes that stuff gets lost in a paragraph and isn't as good for a reader to absorb. So whenever you can, try to present data, even in a paper, in a more visual way. All right, so the second rubric element in this section asks you to analyze the barriers to entry for your firm. So this concept is covered in chapter 14, and it pretty much is what it sounds like. It is a barrier to new companies entering the market. So we'll stick with the example of Nike, specifically in the sneaker industry. What about the sneaker industry could keep new companies from coming in and making their own sneaker brand? Maybe nothing, maybe many things. I can't think of anything really major other than scale. Scale is a big one for a lot of industries that could keep somebody out of the sneaker industry. There's not a whole lot of regulation or patenting around sneakers. So that might be an example of a low barrier to entry industry. Although, you could come up with other reasons why companies aren't successful. Like Ellen says, distribution channels, you might be able to make a sneaker, but how do you get it in a store where people are going to buy it? So that's a major thing. And then, of course, marketing. So these companies, they know that anybody could make a sneaker probably. So they spend a lot of money on advertising to make their sneakers more desirable. And that makes it harder for other companies to be successful in the market. So they might be able to make sneakers, but they might have a hard time being successful and profitable in that industry. And now other barriers to entry might prevent companies from even entering to begin with, not even having a chance of being successful. So those would be things like legal barriers or like patents or regulatory barriers, or some extreme examples of where one company controls a major input that no other company can access, and therefore they can't make the same product. And then the last big one that we already mentioned is scale. Sometimes there's only room maybe for one or two very big companies just because of the size of it. Like satellite radio was that way for a while. Having two competitors meant that no one could really be profitable. So that was sort of a neat case study where we had this very natural barrier to entry that no one was trying to be a monopoly, but it just made sense for there to only be one company just based on the numbers of the market. So those are some of the major ones. We've got the link here to the textbook that goes over everything in detail. So definitely do head there to refresh your memory and kind of get a whole sense of the scope of, all the different kinds of barriers there could be. And as you review that, think about, okay, well, what could apply to my company or my industry rather. And once you sort of have an idea of what barriers there are or what barriers there aren't, if the barriers are low and it seems like businesses could come into the industry very easily, you'll talk about what that means for your company. Now, your company is already in the industry. So we're not talking about their barriers to getting into the industry. They're already there. We're talking about competitors to them coming in. So if the barriers to entry are low, meaning companies can come in easily, what does that mean for your company? How are they going to protect their market share and protect their profit if newcomers can just enter the market at any time? If the barriers to entry are high, what does that mean for your company? What are they making those barriers higher? Are they making extra profit because of those barriers? Are they able to do things that they wouldn't be able to do in terms of research and development because they're not worrying about competition? It really depends on the market, but those are the things we want you to explore once you sort of have an idea of what the barriers to entry are. And then once you've done that element, you'll go to the last element in this section, which is to describe the market structure for your firm and analyze how this affects their ability to influence the overall market. So now this is a pretty straightforward one. There are 4 different market structures, and they're listed here: perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. So you need to decide which of those 4 your industry is. So sneakers, or workout apparel, with the Nike example. Is that perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, or monopoly? And once you've decided that, you need to explain why that is and give some support to that claim. Now we've got a link here to the 4-firm concentration ratio and the HHI. So that's one way that you can. Those are 2 different ways that you can sort of prove if which category it would fall into. And then also there's in our textbook on page 392, we talk about that here. That lists the characteristics of each of these 4 market structures. So that's going to help you determine which one your industry falls in, your market falls in. So between those 2 things, this table on 392 and perhaps one of these calculations, you should have some solid evidence to support whichever of these 4 you decide on. All right, we only have a couple minutes left, and I know we weren't able to get through all of these last elements, so we'll try to get through them quickly. The recommendation section is very much a way to tie up all of the research that you have done in your paper so far and all the analysis that you've presented. The first one asks you to develop a recommendation for how the firm can manage its future production by synthesizing the data presented. So what we mean here is talking about what the company can do in terms of managing how they make and sell their products going forward. So you're going to rely on information that you presented in the supply section, which was back in Milestone 2, and in the cost section, which is here in this milestone. So you should be using some of your analysis from those areas to make a specific or more than one or more recommendations for how the firm can manage that going forward. You might have already suggested an idea in that cost section like we talked about, so you can enhance that here and move forward with that. The next element is asking you to suggest how the firm's position within the market and among its competitors will allow it to take the recommended action. So a company might have a very strong position in their market, or they might be a smaller player in their market, and that might impact how they're able to take certain actions, and you're going to discuss that here. If they're able to take your action, explain why that is based on their position in the market. And then lastly, the last recommendation piece is describe how the firm can sustain success going forward by evaluating trends in demand and price elasticity. So here again, you're going to pull from other parts of your paper. Here specifically, demand and price elasticity. So you'll revisit the trends in demand and the price elasticity that you determined for your firm and see how they're going to address those trends in demand in terms of what they're offering their customers, and in terms of their pricing decisions. How are they going to remain profitable, knowing which side of elasticity they fall on, whether inelastic or elastic demand. So all 3 of these sections should rely on work that you've already done. in the cost section, supply section, in the overall market section, the kind of market, the market share of your company, the barriers to entry, and lastly, the demand and the price elasticity. So make sure that you're pulling those pieces in when you get here and not introducing entirely new things. We really want this to be a kind of cohesive cap to the research that you've already done. All right, we are 1 minute over, so if anybody has any last questions, feel free to pop them up. It looks like things have been quiet, so I'm going to hope that everyone is doing good and taking this all in and thinking about how they're going to apply it to their paper. Thank you, Kelly. Happy Thanksgiving to you too. And to all the ECO 201 students, thank you so much for joining us. We will go ahead and get started with our 202 students. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I will grab our guide for Milestone 3 for ECO 202. All right, so hopefully this will be short, and I'll give you guys back a little bit of your time here on almost Thanksgiving. For anyone who joined us last week, we went over Milestone 2, which was fiscal policy, and this week's milestone is monetary policy. So you'll notice that the setup is largely the same. And so the advice is going to be, in terms of tackling each of the rubric elements, is going to be pretty much the same. But of course, you're going to be looking at a different set of policy tools in this instance. This milestone is on monetary policy, and monetary policy is controlled by the Federal Reserve, and it's policy tools that are focused on the money supply. And usually through the money supply, the effect is on interest rates. So generally, when we think about monetary policy, those are the things that we're thinking about. And the Federal Reserve, just like with the fiscal policy, is usually aiming to influence the overall economy in terms of inflation control, employment, and then after that, economic growth and overall stability. When things are very urgent, inflation or unemployment tend to be the highest priority. And when things are pretty steady, economic growth and financial market stability can be more the centerpiece. So depending on your time period, different things will probably be the focus of Federal Reserve policy, and that would probably change over time. So just like last time, the first element asks you to sort of describe what the monetary policies were at the start of your chosen decade. So were they focused on maintaining low inflation? Were they focused on bringing down unemployment levels? Was the focus on helping boost economic growth at the start of your chosen time period? And what sorts of things was the Fed doing to achieve that goal? Were they decreasing the money supply? Was there, the tools are listed here, and you can look through their notes and figure out what exactly it was they were using to get to their goal in terms of their policy tools. But generally, the end goal is some sort of change in interest rates. So you should be able to see it pretty clearly in the data as on interest rates as a starting point, and you've already got that data from your milestone 1. So the first place to look for this slide and for the next slide on the follow-up policy actions that happen throughout the rest of your time period is to go to the Federal Reserve itself and see, you can find their minutes, and you can also find their own research on what they've done. So we've got a link here to that, the San Francisco Federal Reserve. That's one of the Federal Reserve locations. They've got, Kiara, help me out. I forget the exact number that there are of Federal Reserve banks. I want to say it's 12, but I don't think that's right. But that's the one. Oh, I was right. It was 12. That one is very much focused on on research of Federal Reserve policy. So that their website is where you can go to find a lot of that. I also, from one of our instructors here at SNU, shared with me a wonderful resource that I'm going to share with you guys in the chat. And I'm going to share this with the instructors when I send out the link to this recording. So here it is in the chat. But this is a link to historical minutes of all the Federal Reserve meetings. So I believe if you click this link, it takes you to 2010, but you can put in, once you're there, you can search for any year that you want. And I think it goes back through the at least through the 50s, maybe longer. So that should cover all of our time periods. But I hadn't been familiar with this link. That makes it very easy to go back and find the meeting minutes, and the meeting minutes are where they discuss their policy actions. So really, that's a primary resource, and that's coming. Oh, great, goes back to 1936. So this is really a one-stop shop in terms of finding out what the policies were. You might want to go into other research to sort of investigate their impact, but in terms of knowing exactly what the Fed did, this is the place you want to go. So the San Francisco, their research branch, that's one stop. And then of course this link that I have here in the chat. So do take down that link, and we'll also share it with the link to this recording. But that's where you should start your work. For this slide, this first one, again, you're just going to sort of lay the groundwork. What were the policies in place at the start of your chosen decade and why? So the Federal Reserve had recently increased interest rates in order to bring down inflation. You want to go into a little bit more detail than that, but that's the kind of thing that we're looking for. And as always, the major bits are going to be on your slide. So any graphics that you want to show, any visuals, any tables you want to show, and then text generally in bullet points, and then the explanation to explain everything that you've got on the slide will go in your notes area. All right, and then we get to the next one, and just like with our fiscal policy, you're going to start from where you ended off with what did policy actions look like at the beginning of my decade. How did they change throughout the decade? So in a 10-year period, definitely the Federal Reserve is going to come in and do some sort of action throughout that time period. So you're going to look at what those actions were. If the Federal Reserve was very active during that time, you might need to narrow it down to their most important actions, just in terms of brevity. But in general, they'll have a few major actions to have an impact in the economy that you'll want to discuss here. So you'll say what the actions were, and then using our macroeconomic principles and models, you'll explain why that action would have the desired effect. So we've got a couple of examples here of what you can use. Supply and demand of money model. So if you change the money supply, how does that impact the interest rate? So that we'll talk about that here. And then the ADAS model shows how a change in interest rate can affect GDP, which has an effect on employment, and then also price levels, which is code for inflation. So the ADAS model kind of speaks to GDP, unemployment, and inflation, and the supply and demand of the money model explains the role of money supply and the impact on interest rates. So those are the things to keep in mind. And of course, you're going to want to show those models and ideally show them in some way, or at least explain the reasoning behind them. Now, we talked about it last week. You can draw these models in a very basic sort of way. Our basic supply and demand graph, or the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, has your downward sloping and upward sloping curves, and you can find the equilibrium point and do a shift in the money supply line or in the aggregate demand line. You don't need numbers on the axes. You just want to show, is the interest rate increasing or is GDP increasing? when you work with those graphs. You don't need to put in the numbers. So you absolutely can create these graphs yourself right here in PowerPoint, or some students might be more familiar with Paint. But because there's no numbers, you don't have to worry about accuracy. You just want to show the movement. Is this going to have what's the impact going to be on GDP when my aggregate demand curves moves, or what's the impact on interest rate going to be when my money supply line moves? So I think that's one way to really show your instructor that you understand these models and how to apply them. So I think that's a great step. If that's not your cup of tea, creating those graphs on your own, you can certainly borrow them, sort of copy paste them, as long as they are applicable to what you're describing. So you want to make sure that you find one that fits exactly what you said the Fed did in this instance. And then use that, and of course, cite it if you're going to borrow a graph from someone else. And then use your notes area to explain why it is that way. So if you're showing a shift in aggregate demand in the ADAS model, explain why it would shift that way, and what the outcome would be based on that shift. So again, this is very much like our fiscal policy slide last time. It's just you're looking at a different set of tools. But and the supply and demand of money, that's a new one that wasn't applicable to our discussion of fiscal policy. But the ADAS model can be reused here, and you don't have to worry about feeling redundant. You need to be showing your instructor that you understand how money supply is related to ADAS model. So it might feel like you're being redundant, but in terms of showing your knowledge, it is its own separate understanding. So we want to make sure that you do understand that. All right, I don't see any specific questions on covering this. So this should be pretty straightforward, especially after last week's. You might want to do more than one slide if you want to look at different policy actions separately, especially if they were responding to very different economic situations. So something might have happened in the middle of your time period and the Fed responded with a specific action, and then a few years later something different happened and the Fed responded with this policy action. So you might want to look at those things separately on their own slides. That's entirely up to you. A lot of students are able to sort of bullet point each thing on one slide and include one graph, if they do include a graph, to show the effects of that action and then explain it in the notes. All right, and lastly, just like our last milestone, monetary policy impact. This critical element is looking for you to see if the Fed's actions worked. So just like with last time, you're going to look at the data that we've already got from milestone 1 to see if the policy had the intended effect. So if the effect was to control inflation, did it indeed control inflation? If the effect was to boost GDP, then did it boost GDP? If the effect was to decrease unemployment, did it decrease unemployment? And then you can talk about why or why not. Just like with fiscal policy, it's possible for the Federal Reserve to misread the situation, to not have good timing, or to just not have a strong enough response. So sometimes the situation is more extreme and the policy response is not big enough to combat the thing that they're trying to control in the economy. So sometimes their actions fall short and the outcome doesn't really seem to ever happen, their desired outcome, because their action just was a little bit too small. So those are the ways that the policy actions might not work as intended based on the model that you show above. So your model might show that, yeah, this policy action should absolutely help bring down inflation, but in reality it doesn't. So those are the reasons that reality might be different than the model. And that's a really important lesson in economics, because That's often the case. And I think our looking at this from a historical perspective, sort of hindsight is 2020, it is an important lesson so we can understand when we look to our officials now to make these sorts of decisions about the economy, we understand the limitations of models and can think more broadly about how to tackle economic problems. That it's not always just as simple as, oh, well, I'll do X, Y, and Z, and then everything in the economy will be fixed. This gives us sort of a very reasonable understanding of what we can do with the tools that we have. It's not an exact science, and it's important that we all understand that, because we all live in this economy and make decisions based on it. So that's one of the big takeaways we want for you, and that's why this critical element is included here and in the fiscal policy section. So I think it's a very important exercise to help keep us all informed of how these tools work and the limitations of these tools. And then last but not least, of course, we always have our reference section. So I mentioned this in our last webinar, but I'll mention it again for anybody who didn't catch it. There is no APA style for PowerPoint slides. Your references have to be an APA style, and we've got the link here to help out with that. And that also refers to your in-text citations. So you should have in-text citations. So let's say you grab a graph and you want to share it on your slide, wherever you picked up that graph from, whatever website, or if it was from our textbook. You want to make sure that you use an in-text citation for that, just like you would in a paper. And then the full reference listing will be here on your reference slide. And then the references themselves here on this reference side should be an APA style. But the slide itself does not have a specific APA format. So I don't want anyone spending time looking for that. And that is really it. The key thing here is to, of course, remember what monetary policy is. We've got a reminder here of what it is, and we've got some important links. So once you feel comfortable with that, then you'll be ready to go and do your research, find out what the Federal Reserve was doing in your time period, and then start organizing your slides based on the rubric elements. And once you've got all that, then you should feel a lot more comfortable with talking about the models in terms of the specific actions. So that would be my recommendation for you in terms of planning everything out to make sure that you don't feel overwhelmed or that you're not approaching it in the right way. All right. Well, now's the time for any questions you might have. I know we only have a small group online. Otherwise, if no one has any questions, this is recorded. We'll send it out as early as we can tomorrow. And have a wonderful Thanksgiving.